Okay, it's time for graphing trig functions. We are doing freehand sketches of trig graphs, and we're going to go through a process that will help us do this pretty quickly. We just really have to take our time and think about what we're doing. So looking at this problem right here, it is a sine function, and one thing I'm going to write off to the side here that we really need to keep, you should be aware of, is that sine of x. If we're trying to graph that sine of an angle, it always starts at 0, 0. Knowing where these things start really helps out a lot. And the cosine function always starts at 0, 1. Knowing that really helps out a lot. Now, when we start transforming these, they start at, might be shifted left or right or be stretched out for vertical stretch, but these two ideas right there really help us start the foundations of our graph. Alright, so looking at this, what you really need to identify are the key pieces of information here. And the way I like to think about it is that this number being added or subtracted at the end, that's a vertical shift. That tells you the location of the midline of the graph. So when I see that, I know that this graph is centered, instead of on the x-axis, it's centered around a midline that's too high. So we would go, if we're counting by ones here, which I should label my axis, we'll go 1 too high, and this, I like to draw a little dotted line to help. That whole graph is going to be centered around that line. One of the next easiest things to identify would be the amplitude. And that is going to be your vertical stretch factor. It's the absolute value. So if it's -3, the amplitude's still 3. So the amplitude is 3. What that means is that our graph is going to be 3 units at maximum, 3 units away from the middle line. So what I like to do is say 1, 2, 3 away from the middle, so 1, 2, 3, and draw a little bit of a line right there. And then from the other direction, 1, 2, 3 in the opposite direction. I mean, you don't have to do this, but it does help when you're starting off, that my graph will be entirely contained within those pink lines, and they will be centered around the blue dotted line. So that's the easy way to use amplitude and midline. Now it gets a little bit trickier. We need to figure out the period. The normal period is 2 pi. We're always going to look for this number next to x. Now it should be factored away from the x. If not, you're going to have to do it yourself. But this number is not the period. This is the frequency. But to find period, our normal period is 2 pi when we're in radians. We're simply going to do a horizontal stretch or shrink. Horizontal stretches always work in reverse, so we are not stretching by 1/2. We're not shrinking by 1/2. We're actually stretching by the reciprocal 2. But what's going to happen is we're going to divide by that frequency. 2 pi divided by 1/2. That's going to be 4 pi. Our period of this graph will be 4 pi. So what that means is we're going to start and we're going to finish exactly 4 pi units away from each other. Alright, and then we have this number, which is the horizontal shift. All that means is the starting point is going to start not at 0 anymore. It's going to start pi over 2 to the right. So we are going to start at pi over 2. Alright, so I made this a pretty big, ambitious stretch here. So there's 2 ways I can do it. If I count by pi over 2's, I can probably fit just about as much of the graph as I need. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say every tick mark is going to be pi over 2. So there's pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, and so on and so forth. 4 pi, there's 5 pi, so there's negative pi. And you can pick, if you're making your own graph, you can count by whatever you want. There's negative 3 pi, negative 4 pi, and then there's negative 5 pi. Okay, so we're counting by 1's on this axis, pi over 2's on this axis. It's going to make it pretty easy to graph that way. Alright, so we start at pi over 2 to the right. So for a sine graph, we would normally start right on the x-axis, but that has been shifted up to here. So instead of starting at 0, 0, we're going to start here, right on the graph, right on the midline. But it's shifting pi over 2 to the right, so we are actually going to start there, and you make a point. Now there's 2 ways to go about this next part. I'll do it one way for the sine graph, and then I'm going to redo this problem with a cosine graph, and you'll see the other way you could go about this. But basically what you need to know is that we need to finish this graph at 4 pi. So if we are at pi over 2, you just have to figure out what's pi over 2 plus 4 pi, and that's going to tell you where this is going to end. And if you add those together, it's pi over 2 plus 8 pi over 2, you're going to end at 9 pi over 2. So there's 1 pi over 2, 2 pi over 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 pi over 2. You're going to end it right there. And it's going to end in the same place it starts. So from here to here is a period of 4 pi units. Another easy way to do that is if you're starting at 0, there's 4 pi. If we shift this one block to the right, we're going to shift that ending point one block to the right. And from there, the middle, the graph is going to go up and down and up again. Halfway in between, okay, it's going to hit that line again for a sine graph. So what I would do is say how many spaces are between here. Well, that would be 2 pi. Half of the period is 4 pi, so that's 2 pi. So here's 0 to 2 pi. That's where we would be if we start at 0. We're just going to start at 1 over to the right. And now we're kind of piecing this graph together. And then we could go halfway. Now this is a positive, so it's going to start by increasing. And halfway between these, it's going to hit the top of the graph, or that pink line. So halfway of 2 pi difference is 1 pi. So I need to go exactly 1 pi unit away, which would be right here. So it's going to hit the peak right there. And that's 3 pi over 2. And then same thing, I'm going to do this here. It's going to hit the lowest point exactly 1 pi away from here. So if this is 2 to 3, we just shift that interval there, and we're going to finish right there. And there is our first wave, and we can build the rest pretty easily once we've done that. Now what you should notice now is basically every 2 blocks we're going to transfer from middle to top to middle to bottom and so on and so forth. So instead of doing all that again, I can just go 2 blocks over. I'm already in the middle, so go to the top. 2 blocks over, go back to the middle. Now 2 blocks over, I would be right back at the bottom, so kind of make that happen. And then go backwards, 2 blocks. We're in the middle right now, so 2 blocks would end up at the bottom. 2 more blocks would be back in the middle. 2 more blocks would be back at the top. 2 would be back in the middle. 2 would be back at the bottom. 2 more would be in the middle again. And you're getting a nice sketch of this graph without using the graphing calculator. And there is the sine wave. Now I'm going to do the same function a lot quicker now because I have all the important information, but we're going to do a cosine this time. I'm going to write that in orange. 3 cosine of 1/2 x minus pi over 2 plus 2. Everything's going to basically be the same. We're going to have the middle line and these two, the amplitude stretched out to the pink lines. That's not going to change. The period's still going to be 4 pi. The only thing that's going to be changing is our starting location of 0, 1. Normally we would start above this line. Now we're just going to shift that starting point over at pi over 2. So pi over 2 would be right here. So instead of the sine graph, which starts right on the line, we're just going to start the cosine at the top. And everything matches up, so we can do the same strategy we did before. We just have to go 2 to the right, middle, 2 to the left, or 2 to the right again, bottom, 2 to the right again, middle, 2 to the right again, top, and so on and so forth. And we're going to do as much as we want. I'm just going to draw that. I mean, this continues on. You know, we can go backwards the same way. It's fun, I know. By the way, I think it's funny to say to you that I'm doing this on a Saturday night, so that's how my life is. And I'm cool with it. But the orange graph is the cosine graph. The other thing I would say to you is this. If you look carefully, the period is 4 pi. Another little fun fact you can do, whatever that period is, period equals 4 pi, you can always divide it by 4, always 4, and get pi. What that means is every pi, you're going to hit a special point. So if we're starting here, the next special point will be exactly pi units away. And from pi over 2 to 3 pi over 2, it is pi units. Every 2 blocks on this graph, if you look from here to here, is pi. So every 2 blocks we're getting a new special point.